Hi, everybody. Welcome back to In the Chill of the Night. I'm George Belsky. With me is Ray Gadetti, and our guest tonight, retired ATF Assistant Director Ken Croke, who just wrote a great book called Riding with Evil about his undercover work infiltrating the pagans in Long Island, New York. Uh, great book. I highly advise you to get it. Ken also was my boss when I was the special agent in charge in Newark. He was my deputy assistant director over field operations in the Eastern region. So, Ken, great to see you again. Congrats on the book and your retirement.
Great to see you guys, and thanks, George. Really appreciate it. And it was a fun-filled career, but it's also fun when you get out on the other side, as you know.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's what do you have in your work week is like 6 Saturdays and a Sunday now, right?
Not
Hey
exactly,
Ken,
but close.
hey
Yeah.
Ken, I have an admission. When I reached out for you to ask if you would come on the show, thanks to Pete Gagliardi recommending you, I told you I was going to buy your book, and I told you I was going to read it to cover prior to you coming on. But there was a little bit of an accident with that. You see, I also bought Lou Veloz's book, and I wanted to get that autographed. So I sent that to George to get it autographed. But in doing so, I also sent your book that I was supposed to read to George. So that means George read the book and I did not. But I promise you, I will be reading it, and then I'm going to want your autograph as well. So that's my admission. But hey, look, I met you, gosh, probably about 6, 7 years ago when I was working with the SP
Yeah.
and on the National Crime Gun Governance Board, and I remember you and I both hit it off because of South Jersey, a place that is near and dear to my heart, but plays a huge part in your pagan story. So I was always interested to hearing your side of the story of the Jersey Shore compared to my side of the Jersey Shore. So I'm looking forward to discussing that.
Yeah, there's definitely some differences in the Jersey Shore. For somebody who is not familiar with the Jersey Shore, I sure as heck became familiar. Actually, Jersey as a whole, I became a lot more familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, where does it all start for you with going undercover with outlaw motorcycle gangs?
Yeah, you know what? It's crazy. I had done some other undercover work with some OMGs out in California some years back, early in my career, and I had been doing undercover my entire career. And so this opportunity kind of fell my way, and it was never intended to be. I was never going to be the long term undercover. Matter of fact, there was never really an intention to have a long term undercover. But somebody came in the office one day into a different group, not my group, and had said they had some information on a support club up in New England, and that this club was talking about patching over to the Pagans. And so he gave a lot of information, and it almost seemed to be too good to be true, to be honest with you, when they came in. And the agents, a couple of agents in that group, he come by my office to ask me about, because they knew I had had a lot of experience with outlaw motorcycle gangs. They ran by what they were hearing, and it seemed legit. And it was like, all right, well, hey, let's just put this guy in the box, man. Let's just give him the polygraph, see if he passes. If he doesn't, then we'll go from there. And he did pass. He passed with flying colors. And so then it was like, all right, well, let's, I could go up, I could meet with some of these folks, see what they're about, see what this group is, and see if it was going to be worth the investigative effort, see what they were into, and so forth. But part of it is I had to, we had to come up with a kind of a backstory as to who I was, and he was married, and I needed to meet his wife, because if I knew him, and my backstory is going to be that I've known him for some years, his wife's going to have to stand up to that story as well. And so I went up and met with her as well, and she was actually sharper than he was, and so that part I was comfortable with, and then we had a chance meeting with one of the Devil's Disciples up in the area, and it just ran into him. We were helping him fix a hot water heater, and one thing led to another, and I got invited to a party, and went to a party, met a whole bunch more of the Devil's Disciples, and from there was immediate conversation, because they were going to be opening a pagan chapter up in Massachusetts, and they were looking to patch over and start a chapter. And so conversation, it didn't happen right away. Obviously it went on for a period of time. But again, I was there just to kind of test it out and see if it was worth doing. And the intent was to bring in, a long-term undercover if it warranted it, if we thought if it was worth the effort, if these guys were going to be into some, violations that ATF would be interested in investigating.
Now, Ken, you were a group supervisor when you were going out to do this. So you were like a working group soup. How long had you been the supervisor of the group?
Oh gosh, by that point, I had been the supervisor probably 9 years. I've been a group soup for a long time. And matter of fact, if I didn't have one of the world's worst ASACs, I'd still be a group supervisor. So I was very happy being a group soup. I was a group supervisor who worked investigations, get out there with the troops. I enjoyed it. I did still did a lot of undercover as a group supervisor, and was always willing to help out in that way. So it was a bit unusual, and ATF came up with a rule not too long, coincidentally, right after I came out, that supervisors could no longer do long-term undercover.
Yeah, I throughout my career, I've come across guys where that as soon as they've done something, good or bad sometimes, there's a name that gets attached to the new general order, right? So the Croke rule in ATF is that if you're a group soup or a rack, no working undercover for you anymore. So that's excellent. So but you must have had a pretty good sized group, and then somebody else you could lean on. How were those discussions with in the book? You mentioned your SAC was Andy Anderson, and Andy was my deputy assistant director when I was an ASAC, an acting SAC up there as well, up in Newark. So and I know he's just a gentleman. How did any of your discussions before you went under to take this further? Did it focus on, hey, what's going to happen to the group, or did you have somebody in mind? Or because I know that's a lot on your plate, being a group supervisor, especially in a place like Boston, you're busy, not just doing your own case agent stuff, but handling all the work your guys do.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And listen, I was fortunate that Andy was the SAC up there, because Andy was great, very supportive. But, again, this wasn't, when we came out of the gate, it was not going to be a long-term undercover. And if it was, I wasn't going to be it. But to test the waters, Andy was very supportive of it. He was like, hey, can you do both, or we can get somebody to act. And I said, no, I could do both. This is just going to be, a couple times a week, meeting with some folks and maybe setting up an apartment, but, we could work around that. And he's like, well, you sure? If that changes, let me know. And I will say it at some point as this progressed on, it became less of an option, because I was like, yeah, I could do both, for a while. And he was like, no, you need to focus on what you're doing right now. And we'll have an actor. And there was an agent in my group, Sheila, who she was fantastic and had all the respect of the group members. And so she stepped in, and what she thought would probably be like a month acting assignment, and turned out to be almost 2 years.
Wow. So how does something start off with, particularly federally, that you think you're only going to be doing this for a short while? Isn't your game plan to go long-term?
The game, there really wasn't a plan to go long-term, but there wasn't a plan not to either. But the one thing that was not supposed to happen is it wasn't supposed to be me. But what happened is, once we started meeting different people, and I started bonding with different ones the two individuals who we thought were going to become the presidents of this new chapter. I got tight with both of them individually because I didn't know, it's like going to a horse race. You don't know which horse to back. Both were saying they were going to be the president of this new chapter. I didn't know which one was going to come out on top. So I kind of befriended both. And then one thing leads to another, and you meet other people. And the next thing, before you know it, we'd gotten so far down the road that if we were going to continue to go down into a long-term undercover operation, there wasn't much of a choice. It was going to have to be me. And so, that decision still was like, all right, is this going to be worth it? And then we started, hearing more and more about the Pagans and the new chapter. And part of this was like, a Pagan chapter being open Massachusetts, it's a large Hells Angels area. that's going to create a lot of problems up in Massachusetts, a lot of violence. So like we could get out in front of this. And so that was one of the motivators. But going back to George's point, Andy was super supportive of that. And Andy was like, hey, we got to do what we got to do. This is a rare opportunity and we got to take advantage of it.
Wow.
Ken, so how long was this running? This gather the intel, see if this is worth it phase. How long was that before you knew, okay, I'm really going to have to go in and do this long term?
So I would say it was about 2 months, maybe 2.5, where it was just hanging with the folks up in Mass, the Devil's Disciples. And again, there was 2 individuals who were claiming to be the president, to be.
Are they related to the Pagans or completely?
So they're a support club, and they were going to patch over. 5 of them were going to start a Pagans chapter up in Massachusetts.
Wow.
But to finish, George, your question was, like, okay, so at what point you're going back and forth and you're kind of trying to figure out who's going to be the leader in this thing, and then what are they really going to be into? And then of course you have intel from ATF that are like, hey, the Pagans never been infiltrated. They're extremely violent, the most violent of the big 5 clubs. So what, we don't want to pass up this opportunity. And I think that was the Sachs, position on this. Even later on, when people were like, "Hey, it's time to shut this down," he's like, "No, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. We can't pass it up." And the further I got into it, the less likely it was going to be that I was going to be able to leave and get somebody else in there. And so, I couldn't tell you the exact day, but I remember coming home and telling my wife, like, "Hey, it's not likely I'm going to be able to back out of this, short of shutting down the investigation."
Yeah. Now, before you had done this, I know you had done undercover in the past. Had you ever done any deep long terms like this on an infiltration out in California?
So I did some longer term, not long term like this.
Yeah.
Out there, there was a mafia investigation that I had done out there, and I'd done some undercover work with the Vagos and some others out there, but never at the length of what this was. And so now this was in a league of its own.
Yeah, and for the folks at home, when we talk undercover, there's undercover and then there's undercover, and a lot of ATF, right? What we call the POA, the plain old agents, could go out and buy guns. They could go out and buy dope, and it was 1 or 2, and then you make an arrest, and then there's this where you're completely submerged and living the life, and it really is it's a whole other ball game. And I've never done super long-term stuff, but I supervise guys on storefronts, and so I know how nerve-wracking that was for me as a boss. I can't imagine, and Ken, you do a great job talking about it in the book, the stress and strain on you as you're doing this. How much? I know you're always a big guy, played hockey, so you're stout, but I know you said you gained some weight during this case. How much weight did you gain?
Well, it's funny. I gained weight and lost weight depending on what phase of the investigation.
Sheepers.
Yeah. Going through prospecting, I probably dropped, 35 pounds to hang around prospecting phase, and then I gained that back and then some during.
Can you explain that? Like, what is the prospect hang around phase?
Yeah, so hang around's actually not a bad phase, man. If you're ever gonna go hang around some bikers, that's not a bad one. You get to go to all the parties. You have no responsibility. You're not involved, not allowed to be involved in any of the criminal activity. So it's actually not a bad life.
Why do they want hang-arounds then? Is it as a recruiting mechanism?
A little bit of recruitment, but they're sizing you up. Like I will tell you this: there's fuck around, pagans, and then there's serious pagans, and that goes for every club out there. And they're going to, the ones that are serious about it, like my sponsor was extremely serious about it. This guy. He drank very little, did not do any drugs, paid attention to everything that was going on. There's photos that I look at now, and I see him in the back, and he's just watching everybody. He's not doing a lot of what the other folks are doing. So
Wow.
the hang around phase is it's it's like the honeymoon, right? And then prospecting goes straight to hell, and that's where you are, a servant to the club. And the Pagans do it a little bit different than some of the other clubs, whereas you're a prospect to the entire Pagan nation, meaning I'm not just a prospect to my chapter, it's to everybody. And there's this you have to fill out an application to start with. Then they do this full background. And then they'll run polys when they decide they're going to run polys. So you never know if that's going to happen or not. And then you go through the servitude piece where you go days without sleeping, days without eating. There's regular rituals, they call it the witching hours at mandatories, where they hunt prospects and they just beat the shit out of them with axe handles, which if folks don't know, like, I'm not talking about like your little hatchet handle. I'm talking a full on, it is a baseball bat. There's no difference. And they beat prospects. I mean, there was some horrible beatings. I ended up catching some myself there. It is not fun. And you talk about stress, and it's stress of being found out, but it's also being stressed to having your head caved in. It's, right before I became a prospect, they killed the prospect before me, well, I should say the prospect before me was killed. It's still an open investigation. But that almost shut the whole thing down. ATF's like, what are we going to send you in? Look what happened to the last guy. He got stabbed through the eye into the brainstem and is dead. So we're going to put you in there to see what happens next. So there was a lot of resistance to that. So
wow,
you always have that stuff kind of hanging over your head.
Yeah. Amazing. So let me ask you this, because this, now you've been on the inside. When you started climbing up the ranks in ATF, if you had a guy, or did you have any more folks that did infiltrations like this, and what perspective did that give you as a boss for the agent that's under? About when to pull it. When does it not become worth it for the agent and for the agency?
Yeah, no, one of the reasons I went up, but it starts with because I had an idiot for an ASAC, and my wife got tired of listening to me, and she's like, "All right, the other ASAC job's open. You want to shut them up? Go become the other ASAC." So that was my motivation for being an ASAC. But once I did that, I was like, "Well, shit, I might as well just keep going." But part of it, though, George, was exactly that. It's like, okay, I mean, there's operators who go up into management, not enough of them. And then there's others that go up into management who have no idea what it's like to actually do it in the field. And so I was like, all right, I'll bring that perspective up and hopefully make it easier for others. And I tried to do that as I went up the food chain. And so you're right. I think I had a very unique perspective having done it. Where I would have, when I was in ASAC in Boston, people would ask me, hey, because I was the last long-term undercover to come out. And so they're like, hey, would you support it? And I'm like, yeah, for the right case. If you've got a biker gang of 3 and you want to go infiltrate them, and these guys are doing nothing but, selling stolen motorcycle parts, then no, I'm not going to support it. But if you want to do a legitimate, infiltration into a group, and it doesn't have to be biker gangs, it could be any gang, it could be any organization. I would support it if the targets were good. And I did. And we had some in Denver. They, listen, 9 out of 10 of these, and you guys know this, 9 out of 10 of these things start out with a plan and they don't materialize because the undercover's not accepted, whatever. There's all way more fail than succeed. And so there was a few that I supported, when I was a SAC out in Denver. And some of them went for a little bit, and it wasn't because we pulled the plug. It was because for different reasons we had to stop the investigations, but they were all investigative reasons. So I did try to make it better. I tried to make it easier for those, behind me, who wanted to do this. And I participated in a group, and George, you can relate to this. They finally got tired of, like, a lot of these cases ended up with the undercover and the case agent versus management. And so when I came out, they put together a group, and they brought a group of us together to look at this and be like, why? And I had a unique hat, right? I was an undercover and a supervisor, which was pretty rare. And so they sat this group around and we talked about it for one day. And the next thing you know, something happened and they turned the group's focus onto something else and they never got back to it again. which always bothered me because I really do think there were some pretty simple ways they could have avoided a lot of the aggravation that happens with most of these cases.
Yeah, it's I think you're right. It's not just, can we get the case worked successfully, which means the undercover and the case agent come out okay. We get the evidence we need to make a successful prosecution, but then on the back end, can we do an in-depth after action that the next time we do an undercover case, even if it's not a deep penetration like this, how do we make the wheel a little bit rounder for both the case agent, the undercover, the organization, and our customers at the U.S. Attorney's Office? So yeah, I could see where that would be beneficial.
Yeah. And listen, rule number one for me is that you had to have worked these investigations before, and that you have to have experience in running these investigations before you could supervise those. And so I'll give you a perfect example. When they were doing the Mongols cases out in LA, you had, Eric Harden was the group supervisor for one of them, and he was a SAC for another one, or an ASAC for another one. There's a guy who understood it. There's a guy who supported these and know what it was like, but he also knew when to call bullshit too and be like, this doesn't make sense. Let's think of another way, or let's not do it that way. So, the guys respected him. And then when you have others who are supervising these cases who have never done it, who quite honestly have no business, I could argue they shouldn't be an agent, but it sure as hell shouldn't be a supervisor. And they're the ones shot calling these things. That's where you get into problems, and you make, it could compromise the investigation, but more importantly, get somebody hurt.
Yeah, exactly right.
So let's talk about the Jersey Shore. Unless you want to tell us about St. Patty's Day in New York. Sounds like these shore towns have really created some memories for you.
Yeah, all of New Jersey. I got a whole new appreciation for the state of New Jersey in my time in this investigation.
And we should set it up that over the course of the last, I guess, decade, or maybe more so, in September, was it September or October? There was a biker fest down in the Wildwood area, and that's a place that you found yourself frequenting during that time of the year.
Yeah, no, and it's been going on. Yeah, I'd say 15 or more years.
Right.
That Wildwood Roar to the Shore.
Yep.
And that is a pagan event. And each of the clubs have their events, and you hope that they all stay to their own events, but this is just chaos and pandemonium. I mean, I did 2 roars to the shore, one as a prospect, and then one as an actual member. I became a prospect there. I got thrown out of the club and then got brought back in the club. And I don't know which one was worse, to be honest with you. It's like that thing, like, I don't know, even like as an agent, right? You go to the academy, you're like, oh, this sucks. But when I get out, I'm going to be an agent. This is going to be so cool. I can do whatever I want. Then all of a sudden you're an agent. You got a supervisor who's barking at you for this. And you're like, oh, well, I'm a supervisor. It's going to be so much better. Well, it never gets better. And the same thing happened with the Pagans. It was like, oh, when I'm done prospecting, when I get that patch, it's going to be so much easier. It wasn't. Even when I became an officer in the club, it's just everybody's got a boss, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And giving a little heads up, the Jersey Shore in the summer is just a beautiful place, and it's packed with all sorts of families. And I remember when you and I were talking that, the same places that were set up for families were the same places that were utilized to house these outlaw motorcyclists. And your vantage point was so different than what I would see of the Jersey Shore.
Well, it's funny because talking to folks like you who go there for vacation and it's just hard for me to get past. I could see it, right? The boardwalk, I could see it being beautiful, but it wasn't beautiful when I was there.
Right.
And so, in those mandatories were the worst, as a prospect for sure, but even as a member, because it's just utter chaos. And each day a mandatory went on, the more dangerous it got because, most of the folks are strung out on drugs most of the time and they get more and more unpredictable when they're not sleeping. But being down there, it was crazy because you're in this like coastal community, but it's just full of bikers, and you don't know who's who. So you have, obviously, the Pagans, and there's all their support clubs, and
Right.
there's always conflict going on. And I'll never forget one of the nights we were at one of the motels down there, and the president of one of the support clubs had disrespected one of the pagan presidents, and we were over there, and when we were there talking to that president, he disrespected one of the two presidents I was with, and I was a sergeant arms at the time. They walked away and they said, "Listen, we're going to call him out here on that. We were up by one of the rooms led out to like a roof deck, and he's like, we're going to gut him, and we're going to throw him between these two buildings." It was like a gap of like 3 feet. Like it would have been a long time before anybody ever found him. It'd probably be the smell that would have brought him in. And I'm like, holy shit. I'm surrounded by 500 of these support club members. I've got a gun with 6 rounds in it, so that's not going to work out real well for me. And it's like, all right, how I can't let this happen. I've got to stop it. So like, now what? And I see, some blue lights flashing, like way, way in the distance. I'm like, how do I get their attention? And I'm like, that's not going to work. So what I did is I used their own rules against them. I was like, hey, you guys are talking about, and this is 2 presidents. I'm like, you guys are talking about taking this guy out. You guys know we got to get Mother Club's green light before you can take out our president and one of the support clubs. And one of them, was like, hey, fuck that, we're doing it anyways. And the other one was like, no, he's right. Let's just go over, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, we go back over to where Mother Club was staying. One thing leads to another. Everyone forgets about it, and it never happens. But, that's the kind of thing. Like, every damn day, there was always some sort of event that had you on the cusp of something that you had to either stop or we're going to have to come out of roll for.
How did this chaos breed loyalty? I would think that people would be, all sorts of conflict would occur that people would be turning on each other.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll tell you what, the Roar to the Shore was unique because you had a lot of public interface. And I'll go back to that in a second. The Ohio mandatory, which I found to be the worst of all of them, was you were in this open field with 1,000 pagans and support club members. And that's where a lot of that internal conflict, and I'll share one story. I was a sergeant at arms at the time, and I finally got to sleep at like 6:30, and all of a sudden freaking somebody rapping on my tent at like 7. And there was a lot of chaos the night before, a lot of battles, going back and forth. And I opened the zipper to my tent, and I look, and there's 2 Mother Club members and a president of presidents. And they're like, hey, Slam, come on out here, bring your axe handle. So I come out, and they're like, listen, we got a meeting coming up. And there's going to be 2 pagans in the middle of this meeting. If we nod at one of them, you're to beat the fuck out of them with your axe handle. I'm like, okay. Unbeknownst to me, now, which I'm not going to be able to do this, right? Unbeknownst to me, there's 2 other Mother Club sergeant arms who get the same, command. So we go over here, and what had happened is the night before, one pagan had accused another pagan of being a rat. And they got into a bit of an altercation. It was broken up or whatever. And Mother Club just snapped. So they called all the Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York pagans together. And they're like, and so there's this big half circle. And then you have the Mother Club members at the front of the circle. And then you have me and 2 other sergeant arms in the middle of the circle with the 2 clowns that were battling back and forth. And so we're sitting there, and they're going back and forth. They're asking questions. Tempers are starting to get heated up. So Doc, who's one of the sergeant arms, standing there with me, all of a sudden it's like freaking Babe Ruth stepped up, and he freaking unleashes with his axe handle on this guy named Fender Bender. He just starts wailing away, smacks him in the head, dude's down. All of a sudden I'm like, holy shit, they gave the signal. Now I missed the signal. So now I'm going to get my ass handed to me. I can't participate in this. So all of a sudden, one of the Mother Club members yells and goes, what the hell? Oh, and in the meantime, the other sergeant arms jumps in, and he's wailing away with his axe handle. So Mother Club stops it, and they're like, what the hell are you doing? And he's like, I got the signal. And they're like, from who? He goes, from him. And he's motioning over at the president of presidents. So the president of presidents is a step right below Mother Club. And president of presidents is like, I didn't give any fucking signal. What are you talking about? So the Mother Club member takes the sergeant arms, the first one's axe handle, starts wailing away on him. And I have this all on recording. And meanwhile, I'm like, holy shit, I'm surrounded by 250 pagans. I missed the signal, so now I'm next. Then all of a sudden, now they're wailing away on this guy. Now I'm like, shit. And then they start wailing on the 2 of them. The other Mother Club member grabs an axe handle, starts wailing away on him. Eventually, that gets broken up. Long story short is there was no signal. And so then the national sergeant at arms stops. He's like, this is enough of this, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, you know what? See this guy here, Slam? He's an individual thinker. This guy knows how to follow directions. This is what you want me to aspire to be. I'm like, holy shit. I just went from having my head caved in to being the hero of all the pagans. So like, that's the shit you couldn't predict how this stuff was going to work out.
Wow.
And your cover team is how far away?
Oh, and in that case, miles.
Yeah.
And even if they were a half mile away, I didn't have a transmitter because we would get RF wanded, stripped down naked. Like there's no way. I mean, when we moved the dead bodies, the only time I ever had a transmitter on, that didn't work out so well that day either. But it just didn't have it. So, we always joked, and, when they would briefing is like, they call themselves the body recovery team because they never knew where the hell I was or what the hell was going on. And that was no shot on them. Those guys were out there for a ton of hours. They never complained. Well, some complained, but most didn't. And they were super supportive of the whole thing. So I take my hat off to that crew. And, you guys will see it in the book, the ones that I really had a lot of respect for. But the fact is, and I know it was frustrating for them. And George, you touched on it. It's like, sometimes I think for the cover team or the supervisor, if it's a genuine supervisor, it's more stressful for them. At least I knew what I was doing, where I was. They half the time, they didn't know where I was or what was going on.
Wow.
Yeah, I was never a big UC guy, but I'm telling you, listening to a wire, or then the wire goes dead. And what did he say? Did he call help? Did he what? And it was bad enough as an agent, right? Because it's my friends who were in there, doing the deal, and I'm keyed up, making sure that I'm ready to do everything I'm supposed to do. And then as a boss, for me, it was even worse because did I do anything that's going to get somebody hurt? And how do you let them run with it, but keep it within the parameters? So, the cover team is showing up, and the only thing they're doing is getting revenge, right? And that was always the joke, is undercover would say, "Hey man, just come and get revenge for me." But it's super stressful, and it's a lot of time. But then, and you talk about this in the book quite a good deal. How does that stress then transmit itself to your wife and family? Because she's also an agent.
Yeah. No, and people always ask, they're like, "Oh, so great, your wife being an agent." I'm like, well, it was great because she understood what was going on, but it was terrible because she understood what was going on.
Exactly.
It's not perfect either way. And of course she's an agent, and then we have, 3 young kids at the time. And so it was a lot of stress on her, a lot of stress. And she kept a lot of things from me. So, because she's like, "Hey, you had enough on your plate just trying to keep yourself alive. Never mind adding the stress of having 3 kids or herself or whatever was going on." So yeah, people are always like, "Oh, distance makes the heart grow fonder," and all that stuff. Well, I can tell anybody, if you're looking for marriage therapy, do not go undercover for 2 years, because it's not going to help you much.
Yeah, good safety tip.
Hey, you threw out that teaser before about moving bodies. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so without giving up too much of the whole story in the book, but we, all of a sudden, I was buying some crack cocaine off of Hogman and his source, and right after the deal, Hogman, had his gun in his waistband, puts it on the table, and he's like, "Hey, we ended up having to smoke a guy, and we buried him a few months ago. The property's being sold, and we need to move him. And, need your help." Now, Hogman had just shattered his foot in 5 places, kicking the shit out of somebody, literally shattered his foot in 5 places. So he was like on a cane and a boot. So he wasn't able to really do it. He's like, "I'll go, but you and Tracy, you got to go move this body." I'm like, "All right, that's fine, man. Just let me know when." Now, Hogman was an interesting character. I mean, besides the blood fetish and all that went with that, he was as sharp as a fox, but also as dumb as a box of rocks. Like, and I'll give you an example. If I said to Hogman, "Hey, next month we're going to go to Wildwood," he'd be like, "Okay, all right, I got it." But if I said to him, "Hey, we're going to go to Wildwood in May," he'd be like, "Well, when's May?" So like that was kind of his intellect. But I'll tell you what, he planned and put this thing together, and he had every detail down, and he did not waver for 1 second from it. And so about 2 months went by, and so this conversation about, the body and ATF is all up in arms. Half the people are like, we can't move a body. The other half is, we have to do it. And so most were like, okay, we're okay moving the body, but then we're going to have to shut the case down and dig it back up. And so so ultimately what happens is we travel up to upstate New York, up to the Catskills, and it's freezing cold, man. It's freaking February, and everything's rock solid the ground. I'm like, how the hell are we gonna dig a grave like without a backhoe? And so we get there, and Tracy lived up there, and he had put rock salt down over the ground and let it sit. And whatever. Anyways, if you guys ever need to bury somebody in the middle of winter, I can tell you the tips on how to make that hole work. But no joke, man, you can do it. So we dug this grave, but so there was a large contingent felt that like, hey, these guys have been tipped off, and because when I say in the middle of nowhere, it is in the middle of nowhere in the Catskills, and they're like, they're going to kill you up there, and that hole you're going to dig is going to be for yourself. And then the other half were like, oh, we got to find out, is there a body or not, and so forth. So, I wanted to go. It was the one time they made me wear a transmitter, and the stupid thing freaking malfunctioned in the middle of it. And so we went up there and ultimately dug the grave. These guys got high. We were waiting for it to get dark. We then take 2 trucks, head over. And I'll tell you, man, one of the more intense parts of the investigation was, and again, really on edge. Tracy, so Hogman had a gun in his waistband for the ride up from the city all the way up to the Catskills. Wasn't totally unusual. Wasn't totally usual either, but not unusual. When I got there, Tracy had a gun on him. That was really unusual because Tracy never really carried a gun with him. And he had it on him. He had him on the whole time. And so then we're laying this plan out. And the deal was Hogman was going to drive my truck. Tracy and I were going to go in his truck. We're going to go to where the body was, pick the body up, bring it back, and put it in the grave we had just dug. We'd throw it in the back of my truck, and Hogman would just drive away, and then we'd follow. Anyway, so we go out down this desolate road. There's the cover team's nowhere near us because there's just nowhere they could be. Any lights, you'd see it from friggin' a mile away because there's just nobody up there. And so Tracy pulls over, jumps out of the truck, and heads off into the woods. And I suffered some damage to my knee, and so I wasn't able to really keep up. Jump out of the truck. The next thing he's gone in the woods, and I'm like, "Oh shit, this dude's got a gun. He's in the pitch black woods. I'm going to turn, around one of these trees. He's just going to smoke me." So I'm trying to go tree to tree. There was a moon, that night, so there was a little bit of light, and so we're going, and I'm calling out to him, and he's yelling back, and I'm looking. I've got my gun. I had a gun with me, and I have my hand on my gun, and going tree to tree, and I see a clearing, and there's Tracy, and there's this big tree down in front of him. And behind that was a tarp, wrapped around this body. And so, he's like, "Hey, come on, grab it." So, we pick it up and we're holding it up like over our heads. And we're going up a hill, and he's a little.
How long has he been dead for, the person?
It was about 6 months, 4 to 6 months.
Wow.
Is what they had said. So, the thing, like I grab it, and you can feel like what feels like shoulders, you feel like these bony shoulders. And as we're going up this incline, Tracy's, a little bit shorter than I am, but when we're going up the incline, he's higher. So there's friggin' smelly ass liquids leaking out of this thing over me. I mean, smelled like shit. And it was a little lighter, but we're going up, and I'm like, God, this fucking reeks. We throw it in the truck. Anyways, get back to Tracy's, bury the thing down, put down some lime, and then put the dirt over it, and then put some snow over that. Go into the house, and phone rings like a minute later, and it's Roadblock, and he's calling Hogman, who they're half brothers, and he's like, "Hey, you tell these guys nobody ever talks about this again. Not amongst you, not amongst anybody in the Pagans. Nobody ever talks about it again." So now I know Roadblock's in the conspiracy. I know sure as hell know Tracy and Hogman are. We talked about a little bit. They talked about how they bound him up. They talked about they cut his hands off and fed him. There's a hog farm down the street. They fed the hands, to help hurt the identity, trying to identify the body. They went into that stuff. But then after that night, they never really talked about it again. When we got back to the clubhouse later that night, Roadblock was there. The president had said something about my boots because they were covered in mud. And I tried to, start the conversation. I said, "Well, you guys know where we were. We were out." And all of a sudden Roadblock looks and he goes, "What'd you say? Where are we at?" And I caught myself, and I was like, all right, well, clearly it's not going to be as easy to wrap these guys in this conspiracy is what I thought. So anyway, so they didn't talk a lot about it, and we dealt with it when we got to the end of the investigation.
Wow.
So, going back to the Wildwood Ward of the Shore, I guess it was your first one where your backup agent was with you, and she was hanging around with all the old ladies, and then you got lured off, and there was that sense of panic that why were these guys taking you out? What's that like being undercover, and you're not just worried about you now, you're also worried about uh, your partner that's an undercover, but now you guys have been separated.
Yeah, I'll tell you. At the beginning of this thing, it was like, okay, in George, in Ray, you guys know, like some of these investigations will have 3-4 male undercovers. Some have one, and some bring in females, some don't. And there's pros and cons to all of it. My thing was with multiple males, it's great, right? Because you have males that can go to every event, because oftentimes, like during prospecting and things like that, females can't go to the events. But the other side, it's really easy to get tripped up in your story when you have multiple people who, they can start asking questions between them and what have you. So, for me, bringing another male just was too much of a risk, especially where I was a new guy. I basically dropped out of the sky, and now all of a sudden another new guy's coming in out of the sky. But having a female, allowed me at times, particularly, communicating with the cover team and things like that. It made it much easier. They're not as closely scrutinized. They're not really scrutinized at all. There were times that she could carry a gun when I couldn't. And so on this particular night, George, that you're referring to, so I had gotten kicked out of the Pagans about a month and a half before. And I got kicked out, nothing because of what I did, but the national vice president who had vouched for me, he tried a coup, take over as national president. He got his ass handed to him and thrown out of the club. And so everybody he vouched for got thrown out of the club. So I was on, and honestly, when it happened, I was done. I was like, all right, this is meant to be. I'm out. And they basically asked me, hey, rest up for a couple of days, and let's see. And the Pagans were like, hey, we're going to get you back in, so just hang in there. Anyways, long story short is, went to the mandatory, and so I wasn't a prospect. And so I went over to the president's room, and we're there. There was some out of town Pagans there. There was some Florida Pagans who I'd never met. Some people were hanging out inside the room or whatever. And so mostly the old ladies were inside the room. The guys were kind of out front in the courtyard. And then more and more Pagans were showing up that I had never seen before. And they were coming up from the Carolinas and up from Florida. And they just made a big thing about old ladies causing problems. And that, basically, unless they had a property patch on, they were fair game. And if there's any of them causing problems, they're going to get beaten, raped, or worse. So I'm outside. Next thing you know, PETA and his sergeant at arms are like, hey, we want to talk to you. Let's take a walk, which wasn't uncommon. A lot of times when they were talking business, you'd hit the bricks and kind of walk a little bit away because they were always paranoid about mics and all that. So we're walking, and, we get a fair distance from the motel before it really dawns on me, like, hey, I just left my partner back there with a whole lot of Pagans that I don't even know. Not that I built a strong enough bond that I trust them anyways, but especially when you don't know them. And so I was like, no problem. I'll just call and just be like, hey, everything all right? So I call her cell and she's not answering. I call 2-3 times. She's not answering. Now I'm like, holy shit, what the fuck did I do? And so I'm like, hey, I got to go back. Now, the good news is I'm not a Pagan, so I don't really have to listen. They know it. Like, they can't order me not to do something or whatever. But they're also looking at me like, no, we're not done talking yet. And I'm like, I got to go back. I'll connect with you in a little bit. Like, no. And honestly, I wanted to turn around and sprint because it was my fuck up. It wasn't her fuck up. It was my fuck up. I should have never gotten that far away and allowed them to lure me away. And I wanted to sprint. And so I didn't. I walked as fast as I could, but I felt like it was in quicksand getting back there. When I finally get back to the room, the door, which was wide open when I left, was just slightly ajar. I'm like, holy shit, and so I went and kicked the door, and it was expecting to see the worst. And, there's like 6 old ladies sitting in there, 4 of them on one bed. And, they're just bullshitting and whatever. And it's like you lose your kid in the mall and you find them. The first thing you do is yell at them. It was the same thing. It's like, I was mad at myself but I wasn't going to yell at myself. So I figured, all right, I'll yell at her. And so I'm like, hey, what the fuck is going on with your phone? Blah, blah, blah. Well, she had it on vibrate. She had to sit on the bed. So she just didn't feel it. And again, this is all on me. It was nothing she did wrong. It was 1000% my fault, but I was pissed and I'm friggin', yelling at her. And I mean, it looked good because I looked like a biker, it looked like it was part of the role, but really I was like genuinely scared. And afterwards, we talked about it. It's like, hey, this can't happen. And I can't allow myself to get lured away. You got to make sure you keep your phone on. It was all good, but man, I'll tell you, for that, what seemed like 2 hours, it was probably maybe 10 minutes. It was one of the low points of the investigation for me. And I was pretty pissed at myself for a while after that, because it was like, man, that could have ended so much worse. And it was just stupid on my part.
Yeah. That you got to be on for, always ready for as the agent, but then you also have to be always on for, yourself, for your safety and the safety of somebody else. And that's, you did a great job in the book talking about the stress and strain of what that was like on you and how that but again, I was reading the story going, my God, what's going to happen? And I know how it turns out because you were my boss 5 years later, so I know you didn't die. So but but it's it was a nail biter, man. There were a lot of parts of that book I was turning the pages like I was reading a thriller. So well done.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that means a lot coming from you guys, because you guys know this stuff, like, right? There's a lot of folks, and I always said to my wife, I'm like, I just don't know that there's a book here. And she's like, are you crazy? Like, you live it, and we all live it, and we're all used to it, but the rest of the world doesn't know what this stuff is like, and you need to share that story and tell it in a way that people can understand it and make it an easy read, so it's not like super complex, but that you understand what what complexities that are there.
Yeah. Hey, speaking of complexities, you've described these folks as criminally insane and violent, but you've also befriended them. So what was that humanistic side? Could you identify with these killers at all?
People always ask, like, oh, did you ever like any of them? I will say this. I disliked some less than others. There's none that were, particularly good people. But there were some who would just, listen, some of them were in this for, they just needed a belonging and they want to be part of a group. And then there was the hardcore criminals. And then there was just the psychopaths. And so you had that blend going. And there was some that, Doc, one time really looked out for me. They have a thing called the witching hour when you're, at a mandatory and you're a prospect. And they basically hunt for you. It's like 2:00 in the morning. They hunt for you and they beat you with axe handles. And this guy hid me out when they were hunting for me. And I caught some axe handles on a different night, but not that night. Hellboy was another one. Hellboy, when he was strung out on meth, the guy was extremely violent, an MMA fighter, a true bad. I mean, most of the pagans were scared to death of him. Very, very unreliable. You just never knew what this guy was going to do. When he wasn't strung out, he was like a regular dude. I mean, he was, rational, other than the fact that, he'd tear somebody's head off in a heartbeat, but like rationally, you could talk to him or whatever. And I'll tell you, he and I had built a relationship. And when the case came down, the final night, I did a large meth deal with him, and it was decided it would be safer to take him off in a car stop after a meth deal than it would be to hit a house with him inside, because he was just freaking insane. And he refused when they got him and they said, hey, Slam's a cop. He's like, no way. He goes, there's a lot of people, a lot of pagans I would think are a cop. There's no way Slam's a cop, and he wouldn't believe it, like all night. He wouldn't believe it. But there was a night when he was strung out and he'd gotten sideways with a Mother Club member. And you just don't do that. And he did. And the Mother Club member pulled me aside and he said, Slam, I want you to go kill him. And I'm like, well, me and who else? This guy's an MMA fighter. Like, we got other guy. He's like, go to your truck and get your 44 and kill him. So now it's like, geez, I can't do that. And I'm walking out to my truck to get my 44 and this Hellboy. And I'm like, hey, bro, listen. You got to go make it right with the Mother Club member. And he's like, fuck him, blah, blah, blah. He's still, he's all, but because I had built this relationship with him, I'm like, listen, bro, don't do it for him. Do it for me. do it for me, because they want me to take you out. And if I don't take you out, they're going to take me out. So like, the only way to make this right is for you to go back in there and apologize. And he's like, fuck them, blah, blah. And I'm like, listen, bro, I'm asking you. One bro to another. And he's like, all right, I'm doing it for you, Slam. I'm not doing it for them. And he went in there and he apologized, made it right, and there was no other way out of that situation.
Wow.
And so like, some of the relationship you build they're all part of the investigation, right? But the stronger the bonds you build with some of these guys, somewhere down the road that may come in handy. And at times, when it's coming down, you're wondering like, oh, was this the worst of the worst? But there were some, when it came down to recommended sentences and stuff, there was one guy who was, looking at 15 minimum mandatory and just didn't feel like, he deserved it, the enhancement. So, we were like, hey, give him the 5 years. And so, it wasn't like we were trying to put everyone, I mean, there was guys, Hogman was facing 100 years and, because he got splatted on the road when it should have been me. It was costing like $1 million a month to keep shipping him around for a court. And they're like, hey, let him plead to 11 years. And he's not going to live 11 days. So don't worry about it. And I was like, all right, fine. Let him plead to 11 years. Of course, that fucker makes it 11 years. And I was at one point figuring he's going to outlive me, but he died a couple months after getting out of prison. But anyways,
when you say you got splattered on the road, talk about that.
So yeah, people, again, people are like, oh my God, are you afraid of the Pagans? And when you're in there, yeah, certainly, because the further you get in, the longer you're in, the more charges you're building. On day one, if I knock on the door and they say, hey, beat it. Okay, nobody's killing me, right? I don't have anything. But the further you're in there and the more evidence you get, and the only way to get rid of you is to get rid of you. And so, you had that concern with the Pagans. But honestly, I told my wife, I said, listen, the bike is the number one threat. We ride 110 miles an hour, gear down, 3 feet off of each other, and we ride two abreast. So like that's and listen, everyone thinks bikers can ride bikes. They all can't. Some of them are actually really shitty bike riders. And so you learn to stay away from those guys really quick. But and then of course the Hells Angels, the rivalry there. And I'll tell you a quick story on that. But the bike, we were on a big run, and we had there was a whole bunch of us, and we just gotten back to the chapter president's house, and he had sent me and Hogman, who was the VP at the time, and I was the sergeant at arms, out to pick something up. And so the vice president has no status unless the president's dead or in jail, and the president wasn't, so he had no status. So I was the highest ranking. So highest ranking rides front left, and then it works its way back in rank. So I pull out front left. I'm the highest ranking, Pagan. And so we're going down the road, and he pulls out and he pulls around me into the other side of over the yellow line, and it starts riding front left. Well, I'm like, hey, listen, I'm a make-believe biker. I don't give a shit. You want to ride front left, ride front left. It's no skin off my back. So we don't make it a quarter mile down the road. As we're turning a corner, a minivan splatters him all over the road.
Wow.
It wasn't his fault. It was the minivan. Literally splattered him. He coded out. They brought him back to life. He actually coded out a couple times. And so like later on during the prosecution, he was a medical mess. And that's where that plea part came from. But, backing up, I said I'd share another story on the Hells Angels. That was the other concern. It's like the Hells Angels they were always going at it with the Pagans. And so when I told you I got kicked out of the club through no fault of my own, because of the national vice president, I should have been on guard duty, but I got kicked out of the club. So I went back up to Boston, and I kept in touch with these guys, as the case agent and others wanted me to. And of course, the Pagans were saying, hey, we're going to get you back into the club. Well, the night I was supposed to be doing, one of the nights I was supposed to be doing guard duty out in front of the clubhouse, about 30 Hells Angels and the support club members rolled up in the clubhouse, and there was only the chapter president inside, and then the sergeant at arms was outside. And they rolled up and they beat the shit out of him, man. Beat the shit out of him with ball peen hammers. He had to get med flighted out. That would have been me. It should have been me. I was the one who was supposed to be standing out there, and because I got kicked out of the club, it wasn't. So, people are like, oh, it's amazing, the skill. It's like, listen, a lot of this stuff is dumb luck. It's, do you have the luck on your side, and how long is that luck going to run?
Wow.
Yeah. So Ken, you have the stress and the trials of doing the undercover. you're battling with ATF management, both to keep it going, to shut it down. It's gone from the Boston office down to New York. DC is monitoring it, so you're fighting the pagans. You're fighting somewhat ATF management. Then you wind up having to fight with the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York as the case is wound up. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the case was prosecuted ultimately. I mean, in numerous different jurisdictions. The two main ones were the Eastern and the Southern districts of New York, but it was also involved in Boston and Ohio and in Maryland, and so there was the U.S. Attorney's Office as a whole was fine. What happened is there was a lead prosecutor from Southern District and a lead prosecutor out of Eastern District, and they both were great. When the case started, as the case was ongoing, and shortly after the case came down, the lead prosecutor in Southern District went out on maternity leave, and they replaced her with a white collar AUSA who had no experience in these types of investigations. And we were briefing him early on and telling him what was going on. He's like, wait, am I correct in hearing that you witnessed crimes and didn't prevent them? And I'm like, yeah, every day. Or else this would have been a one-day investigation. And
Wow.
He's like, well, what authority did you have to do that? And I'm like, what do you mean, what authority did I have to do it? And he's like, well, what authority? And thank God, man, we had gotten a letter authorizing me to take part in tier 1 and tier 2 activities, criminal activities, from the director of ATF signed it and the U.S. attorney signed it. Not an AUSA, the U.S. attorney. And so I had that letter, and so we explained it to him, and this clown was like, well, they didn't have the authorization. I'm like, what are you talking about? How do they not have who else is it? The president? Is the president supposed to sign off on me, doing these long-term undercover investigations? I mean, what are you talking about? So anyways, yeah, at one point, this clown was talking about it, like having me plea to an information.
What?
Yeah, for the crimes that I was a part of. Yeah, it was like, I'm like, this is not real. Like, there's no way this is happening. And I will say this, the U.S. attorney for the Southern District caught wind of it and immediately removed this guy. And they brought in another prosecutor named Tim Sini, who was the best. I asked him a straight out question on the reassignment of this other U.S. attorney, because they lied to say that he had a trial get moved up. I mean, when have you ever heard of a trial getting moved up? It doesn't make So I asked him, I said, hey, what was the real reason? He told me the real reason. I was like, all right, man, you and I are going to get along fine because you're not lying. And Tim Senior is a straight up great attorney. We had a ball working together. He did a phenomenal job of prosecuting, his portion of this case. Yeah, it's crazy. I will say props to ATF's division counsel. Particularly in New York, he went to bat and he was like, it's not going to happen. And here's why. And so ultimately it went away. It was a bunch of nothing. But it's like, who needs to stress at that point in your life? I mean, you finally get out from under this case, and now all of a sudden they're talking about indicting you.
Yeah. Speaking of legal woes, tell us about the time you got arrested.
Yeah, it was a highlight for me. And it's funny because there's people who were like, oh, so that's smart. You went and got yourself arrested. I'm like, all right, no, I didn't go get myself arrested. It wasn't part of the plan. But yeah, it was, so it wasn't too long. The heat with the Hells Angels had really gotten turned up, and there was a lot of back and forth with the Hells Angels. And, so there was word had it that they were going to try to come out the clubhouse again. And so there was a bunch of out of town pagans who came in, and the area was really heated up. And honestly, we couldn't control it. Like, there was no way I was going to be able to say what was going to happen or not happen. So, ended up reaching out to the cover team, just said, hey, get some gang unit guys in here from the local department. Obviously not telling them there was an undercover in there, but just heat this area up. And so they did, and the gang units were all over the place. And eventually the Pagans who were in town, and they bought bombs with them. They were going to blow up some of the Hell's Angels locations. Like it was not going to go well. And so the Pagans like, hey, it's too much heat. We're not going to be able to do this. And so eventually it calmed down. Some of the out of town Pagans had left. Some were still there, but some had left. And there was I didn't think there was any more gang unit cops around. I was hungry, wanted to get something to eat. And I had a gun on me, and I'm like, all right, I don't want to leave the gun in the clubhouse because God forbid the cops show up here and one of these clowns grab my gun. And I didn't want to walk down the street with it for fear that I'd get jacked up and have a gun on me. So I walked around in my truck, and I opened the back door, and I had a large pickup truck, so it was high, and slid into the back seat, and I taken the gun out and slid it into the map holder, behind the seat. And you know how you get that feeling like, oh, I just fucked up. And so I slid it in there, put a poncho over, else, and I'm like, shit. I shut the door and I locked it. And unmarked cruiser comes whipping up. The next thing you know, I'm on the ground, proned out. They're like, hey, what'd you put in the truck? I'm like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Now, across the street is 15 Pagans sitting there staring at me. Even if I wanted to say something, which I wouldn't have, but I couldn't anyway. So I'm like, I don't want to talk about go fuck yourself, playing my biker self. And so they're looking in the window. Next thing you know, the cops, he grabs the keys and he's like, I got it, And so they find the gun. Mistake number one for me is, so I was, my background was I was a convicted felon, which that wasn't a mistake. My felony conviction was for kicking the shit out of a cop. That was a mistake. So I wasn't given the best of treatment as I was locked up and processed. So I spent a couple days in jail by the time, and, they couldn't, so the Pagans got me an attorney right away. They had one on retainer. And so I had to stay enrolled. And then I'm thinking, holy shit, I hope all my backstop and stuff stands up because they're going to be getting discovery and all this other stuff. And ultimately, the Pagans bailed me out. ATF, was back and forth of what the hell they were going to do. I don't know. The Pagans stepped up and bailed me out. So at least I got out after a couple of days.
Wow.
Oh, man.
Hey, Ken, I have to ask you then, because we're coming up on an hour here, what is the draw for these outlaw motorcycle gangs? And I say that because I thought they were just going to dry up. I didn't think people had the interests, the passion, particularly as you described it today, what it takes to be an outlaw biker. But there still seems to be a draw. Why is that?
Listen, their numbers are on the rise. I think after this case, the Pagan numbers were going down, but they've rebounded big time. And a lot of the other ones have as well. And there's more chapters now than there were 10 years ago. So there is a draw. And I don't think there's a one size fits all. I've had people say, hey, it's a lot of military people or ex-military. No, I don't think that's true. I think there's some, like any other, there's all sorts of different professions. There were cops who became bikers. Like there's no single thing. I think for some folks, it's an identity, and listen, I will tell you this, and I will never understand it. We would go into bars and it were like we were rock stars. The whole place would hush. Guys would come up and kiss our ass. Girls would be all over you. And listen, these were not good looking men that I was hanging out with. All right. Some of the ugliest humans I've ever seen. And in these guys had all sorts of women who were interested in them. And so I think that's part of it. Is it just like individually, they're all a bunch of losers, but when you put them together, they had some notoriety and that appealed to them.
Wow. Ken, long and short of it, was the case worth it for you professionally and personally?
So I think professionally it's worth it, not in the sense that it helped my career, because it sure as hell didn't. But it we put a lot of bad people in jail, and we got to other club members and put them in jail. And you don't do that if you don't have an undercover that goes in and is able to infiltrate. And so I think in that sense it was good. And there were a lot of spinoff. We talked about the prosecutions, the direct ones that when I came out, there were many of them that came later that were spinoffs of this, and there's still intel that's being used to this day. So that was all very beneficial. I spend a lot of time talking to law enforcement groups about this because I believe others need to do it. I'm not doing it, but there's others that need to do it. And people always ask me, they're like, "Hey, are you glad you did it?" Yeah, I am. I'm glad I did it from a professional standpoint. I want to know the modern era is more and more difficult to do these types of things. And I want to see, hey, could it be done? And then, B, we had a big impact. But the second part to it is, would you do it again? And the answer is hell no. Because it does take a toll on you. It does take a toll on your family. And is that worth anything? The answer to that is no. And I was lucky. I have a terrific family, super supportive wife who held it all together. But she didn't share a lot of things with me when it was happening, because she's like, "Hey, you had enough. I wasn't going to pile on to that." But now knowing what I know, it's like I would never do it again, because it's not fair. It's not fair to the rest of them. They didn't sign up to do it, and they all went through hardships. And they're the reason why I wrote this book. I mean, I had no intention of writing a book. These guys were like, "Hey, you have to memorialize the story, because someday you're going to be gone, and then the story's gone with you, and
Wow.
People need to know what this is about." So they are the reason why, Riding with Evil is in existence today.
Wow,
man. So where can anybody who hasn't already bought the book, and you need to buy the book and read it, where can they get a hold of it? Where's the best way to get a hold of it?
It's everywhere. I mean, it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's in all the local bookstores, and big fan of the local bookstores, and supporting those, because as there's getting to be fewer and fewer of those. Yep. But it's everywhere, and there's the audio version, there's the Kindle version. I didn't think anybody owned a Kindle anymore, but apparently they do. A lot of those sell. And in the hard copy. So it's pretty easy to come across it.
So
there it is. Look at it.
Did you do the audio part for the audio book?
You're not the first person to ask that question. No, I picked the audio. They gave me 5 audios. But yeah, so I got to pick the voice, but it is not my voice.
Wow, that's very cool.
It's 9.5 hours. Awesome. I couldn't stay that focused for 9.5 hours to read that story.
Hey, Ken, I want to thank you for coming on, but I do want to give a shout out for 2 people. Pete Gagliardi. Obviously, there was only room for 3 of us on this, but he definitely wanted to speak to you. And also Carlos Canino. He happened to give me a call earlier today, and I told him you were coming on. So he's excited to hear this.
Well, that's great. I appreciate all the support, and I really appreciate you guys having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Ken, it was an absolute pleasure. I hope this thing sells 1 million copies, and they make a movie out of it, because it would be worthy of that. Great job, and it's great catching up with you, man. All the best moving forward.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. And George, I'm down your way, and I'm going to be giving you a shout.
Hey, yeah, please do, man. Please do.
Yeah, I'm down that way a lot, so I will do that. And there has been some Hollywood interest, so you never know. This could show up on the screen someday.
And Ken, of course, if you want to come back to the Jersey Shore, let me know.
Well, if you got a good spot in the off season, I try not to make it there for biker week anymore.
No, not on the off season. That's the problem. On the peak season, that's where we have to have you down.
Yeah. You're right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate your presence here.
All right, guys, take care and be safe.
Ken, be good.
Take care. All right. Bye.
See ya.